Thank you very much, Caitlin, and good afternoon, everyone. What I've been asked to go through today is looking at drought decisions with a focus on drought recovery. So what we'll be talking about is the drought recovery juggle, some considerations around when to restock and what to restock with, look at whether leasing is an option, whether you should stay or go, financing restocking, and using your network. So getting straight into it, the focus of this talk is more on drought recovery. So developing a plan to come out the other end of the drought rather than the here and now. I don't have the answer and don't pretend to have the answer. And there's a lot of experience amongst the audience in managing drought and within your network, which I'll talk about as well. I'm very aware that every drought is different and everyone's circumstance is unique. But even with that, you can plan for the drought recovery before it does rain, and I think it is important to have a plan. Even if that plan changes as circumstances change, when things that are unforeseen eventuate, it's important to have that plan. And what we're going to go through today is just discuss some things for you to consider in developing your drought recovery plan. There are resources which Caitlin is able to email out afterwards. There'll be a printout of the slides, so everything I've gone through here will be there for you to refer to. Some AE and DSE tables, which I'll refer to also, and a spreadsheet tool to look at evaluating different restocking options for people to use. I think drought recovery is primarily around managing the drought recovery juggle, and it's a very difficult juggle where you're trying to juggle livestock numbers, land condition, cash flow, and personal well-beings and relationships. And that's a very difficult juggle, and there are trade-offs and antagonisms within that. Focusing on one area or doing something to benefit one area of that juggle can come at the expense of another, and that's impossible to avoid. It needs to be taken into account, but it's impossible to avoid, and each of those areas is going to get put under pressure during drought recovery. And I think it's important to make sure in your planning and ongoing decision making to make sure you give consideration to each of those areas in your planning. Don't leave any out or have the others be at the expense of one. So the first question to ask is when to restock, and the answer to that may be pretty obvious, not till after you've had pasture growth. So for some people it will be a way off, and that's right, you can't do it until you've had pasture growth, but I think there's a bit more to that question, and that you should also consider when pasture growth is likely to occur, and I'll have a look at some information on that, the need for wet season spelling, and how long the available feed will last once you do get pasture growth. So looking at pasture growth, there's lots of rainfall predictions out there. Unfortunately, they're not that accurate. They're working on making them more accurate, but they're not. The good news is that research has shown that pasture growth can be predicted with better accuracy than rainfall. And there's a reference for that claim there if anyone wants to look it up. And there's some good information available for producers within the Long Paddock website on pasture growth. And these are being added to over time, and I think they're quite useful. So one of those we'll have a look at now is looking at Queensland and saying what pasture growth is likely to the end of October. So this map simply shows median pasture growth, which means in 50% of years you'll have more pasture growth than that, and in 50% of years you'll have less pasture growth than that from August to October, based on the 60 years of data from 1957. So as we can see, with a summer dominant rainfall there's not a high chance of, or not a lot of growth probable between now and the end of October for a lot of the area that we're looking at here. The next, and that's just based on historical records. There's no forecasting component in there. If we look at a predictive component, we can ask what is the chance of exceeding median pasture growth between now and the end of October, and we get a pretty mixed map there. There's some regions where it's saying there's a higher chance of exceeding median pasture growth, but that's just saying you're going to get a bit more than the not much we saw in the previous graph, and other areas there's a low chance. So you'll be able to draw your own conclusions from that. And there are resources on the Long Paddock website where you can get down to individual properties and ask these questions. But between now and October, I'd say there's a limited likelihood of significant pasture growth for a lot of the area. Just on the percentiles there's quite a useful video on the Long Paddock website to help explain it. It can be a bit confusing, the percentiles, but they're a useful resource if you understand them. And there's quite a good video developed there to help explain them. So for your circumstance, and each of you will be unique, what chance do you have of significant pasture growth before summer? For a lot, I'd say it's pretty low chance. Then what are your current stock numbers, whether you express that in AE or DSE, and what feed do you have available until midsummer when you can expect pasture growth? And do you have sufficient pasture to carry a stock through? And if you don't, what are the decisions there? And again, that will be unique to everyone. But looking at the other side, when you do get pasture growth, an important consideration, I think, is the ability to wet season spell. So wet season spell is allowing the pasture to grow without being grazed during the growing season. So they can get up, establish their roots and set seed. And it is one of the most effective ways to improve and build land condition. Land condition is the foundation of a grazing business, I think. And what land condition effectively is, it's the ability of your land type to convert the rainfall that it receives into pasture growth. And in the grazing land management material, which is a good resource, they've got land condition broken up into A, B, C and D category. If land is in A condition, then for that type of land, it can generate 100% of its growth potential from a given amount of rainfall. If it's in B condition, it's in 75%, it can only generate 75% of that pasture growth, which means you can only run 75% of the stock that you would otherwise. C gets down to 40% and D 20%. Something I'm doing with my clients is getting them to do a land condition assessment by someone independent so they know where they're at. And there's very few places that are all in A condition, and there's a lot of B, C and D condition country around the place. So whilst you can't control the rainfall you get, you can control the land condition, and improving that land condition will put you in better stead for future droughts. So coming out of this one, if we do get a good growing season, giving consideration to being able to let that country spell and come back over the growing season to improve land condition is important, I think, as most environmental damage occurs coming out of a drought while those plants are trying to get up and get established. And if there's stock there chewing the tops off them, that limits their ability to come back. If you've had to draw down on land condition during dry times, for want of a better term, which can be inevitable, then this is the opportunity, if you do get a season, to repay it. The other consideration is how long available feed will last. Once you get growth, will it be enough to last you through until the following summer? If you move after the first growth event, do you run the risk of not being able to carry those animals through? And also, how will you limit the ability of your country to recover? Won't know until we get to summer, but just some things I think to think about in advance. What to restock with? So some key questions I think is, what type of livestock can your country and existing infrastructure profitably run? Some of you will have a number of options due to your land type and infrastructure. Others, the option will be limited, but obviously important to know that. Probably more importantly is, what do you have the passions and skills to manage very well? And to be a profitable producer of any type of livestock, you have to be a specialist and you have to be very skilled. You cannot afford to be an average producer, because average producers generally are not making sufficient money for their businesses to be able to fund all the needs of the family. So you have to be an above average producer, and therefore you need the passion and skills to manage that enterprise to the best of its ability. So which ones do you have the passions and skills for? A couple more hard questions here. Do you have sufficient scale to be a multi-enterprise business? There are a lot of businesses that are multi-enterprise. The common example is running sheep and cattle, and in a lot of cases it results in two under-scale enterprises where both are constrained, and the business may be better off focusing on just one enterprise and running it well than having two under-scale enterprises. So if your enterprises are less than about 10,000 DSC or 2,000 AE, then they may be affected by scale. Further from that is, do you have sufficient scale overall to be a standalone business? If the whole business is less than that 10,000 DSC or 2,000 AE, depending on where you are, they're not hard and fast numbers, then it may not have sufficient scale to be a standalone business, which may present the opportunity to generate off-farm income to support the family needs. But I do think that's an important consideration, but again, unique for everyone. So what options do you have? There's a few there, the obvious ones: cattle, bull sheep, meat sheep, goats, agistment or leasing, and we'll go through each of them. And there's an article written last year by Phil Holmes, who I work with, on choice of enterprise, and that link will come through in the stuff that Caitlin will send through to you to have a look at that, and that just helps weigh up the pros and cons of different enterprises and may be a useful resource for you. Some considerations on what to restock with. Management usually trumps enterprise type, and there is an exception to that, which I'll get to. But what that means is how well you manage the enterprise you've got in terms of being a skilled operator that focuses on the fundamentals and profit drivers is usually more important than which enterprise you run. And in this, there's an element of short-term and long-term planning. Unique for each business again, but I think you need to be clear on what your core enterprise is. What is your business going to be going forward, and what's going to get that back up to speed as quickly as possible. That doesn't mean you can't have animals that aren't part of your core enterprise as trades, but it does mean that they need to get you up to your core enterprise back to capacity as soon as possible. And I think it's important to have some flexibility around a pretty clear plan of where you want to get to when the business is back up to full speed. And unused capacity does come at a cost. If you're building your numbers back up slowly, taking into account what I've said about the need to wet season spell and let the condition come back, if beyond that you've got unused capacity sitting there idle, that does come at a significant cost to the business. Your overhead cost structure are pretty fixed in terms of what it costs you to run the business each year, and not utilising that capacity does come at a cost. In looking at different options, I think it's important to compare the capital outlay and the returns on a like-for-like basis. Either per AE or DSC are the most common. Can be done per hectare, but I think animal unit is the most applicable, and the tables which Caitlin will send through can help you do that. It just lets you compare it on a like-for-like basis, which per head you can't easily do. And something I think is important is making the correct decision versus the right decision. You don't have a crystal ball, unfortunately, and it is a risky game you're all in, but all you can do is make the correct decision. And what I mean by that is gathering all the information you can, weighing it up and making a rational decision about the information you have at hand of what you think the best outcome is going to be. If that was the best decision to make with what you knew at the time, then that's the correct decision. Unfortunately, only time will tell whether it's the right decision when things eventuate, but if you make the correct decision, more often than not, it will end up being the right decision. Quite often I see indecision where people are scared to make a decision that isn't the right decision, and that avoids the decision or has decision paralysis. and that can avoid it, then that can damage the business. So focus on making the correct decision rather than the right decision. So I just want to go through now how to look at, or how I suggest to look at some different restocking considerations in the short term. Pick a time frame. I'd suggest 2 years, but it's up to you. 1 year, I don't think you get to fully compare different options, particularly if you're buying young stock. And if you get to more than 2 years, it turns into more of a modelling exercise. So I suggest 2 years, but up to you. And a useful way to compare options sometimes can be to compare them to the do nothing option. Or what is the status quo? If you keep doing what you're doing, what does that look like? And compare other options back to it can be a good way to compare different options and look at a number of scenarios. It's far better to use a back of an envelope or a spreadsheet to test decisions and work out which is the best than in reality. And you can look at a number of different scenarios and work out what's going to be the best for you. So the information I think you need is the class and description of the livestock, what they're going to cost landed on the place, their average AE or DSE rating for the first year and the second year, because they will grow or produce over time, that will change. What are you going to spend on them? Do you have to vaccinate them, shear them, put money into them in terms of direct or variable costs? What's that going to be in both the first year and the second year? What income will you have and when? Will you sell a percentage of them in the first year? And if so, how much for? Will you have a wool clip to sell off them? What are you going to get from them over the time frame? How will your overheads change? Now, this is quite a difficult one, and it does require a good understanding of what your cost structure is, but it's looking at the different options and saying, okay, well, if I'm getting option A, which might be young sheep versus dry cattle, young sheep are potentially more labour intensive, and your overheads, your wages, fuel and things like that may change. It is difficult. If it's too hard, leave it static, but it's important to at least give it some consideration. What will you have at the end of the period that you're looking at in the form of livestock? What will you have? What will they weigh approximately, and what will they be worth using conservative estimates? Once you've got that, you can compare the options in terms of what capital is required for each, the annual grazing load over each year for that, the gross profit, which is sales less purchases plus or minus inventory change, what the enterprise or direct or variable expenses are going to be, the gross margin from the option, the change in overheads, then the net cash flow, which is all of the above except inventory change, what the contribution of that venture will be to earnings before interest and tax or operating profit in total per AE and per dollar invested, the annual finance costs, and what their contribution to earnings before tax or operating profit after interest is. So a bit there, a bit of jargon, but that's all pretty straightforward if you've got that information. And the spreadsheet we've developed, which Caitlin will send out to you to use entirely at your own risk, will help you go through that. If you get the assumptions right going into it, it'll help you look at the different options there on a like-for-like basis and just help inform your decision on which one to look at. Just want to talk very quickly about an example of cows and calves versus PTIC versus heifers. If you're looking at cattle, the conventional wisdom sometimes can be the cows and calves are better because you get a quicker cash flow, and at different times that may be the case. But whenever I've done these sums, it usually comes out that the value of cows and calves is quite high compared to, say, heifers over time. Whereas heifers, you buy smaller animals, they eat less, lower investment per head. You can still generate a cash flow from them by selling those that don't meet your mating weight or selling those that don't fall pregnant and have cash flow. And you can also impose your management on them, whereas cows and calves and PTIC are usually a result of other people's management. It all comes down to the prices at the time. It's just important to use that process I've been through to look at the options and see which is the best, rather than just presuming one is the best, and the market will change over time. I want to move now to some longer term considerations. A key bit of information, I think, is what is your long-term carrying capacity? How many AE or DSE can you comfortably run in the long term? There was some very good work done about 30 years ago in Western Queensland on safe carrying capacities, and a lot of that will still be relevant. The forage website can help you look at estimated dry matter production or pasture production, from which you can work out your carrying capacity. But as grazing business managers managing multi-million-dollar businesses, I think this is an essential bit of information, and there are people that, independent people that can help you generate it. What is your land condition? How good is your country's ability to convert rain received into pasture growth? Critical part of your business and important to know. And there's things like the Grazing Land Management Workshop and Grazing Fundamentals Workshop, which will cover the principles involved in them and help you understand that. Just want to run through now some longer term considerations from my point of view of things to consider for each enterprise type to maximise the performance. For cattle, and this applies across all of them, looking at per animal performance versus number of animals. Scale in a pastoral business is important in terms of having economies of scale or sufficient scale to spread the largely fixed costs over. For cattle, that's around 2,000 or 3,000 AE. Less than that, the business is constrained by scale. But beyond that, additional animals don't necessarily add to the bottom line. It comes down to per animal performance. Getting the most out of each animal has more of an impact on the profitability of a business than the number of animals, which may sound a bit backward, but that's the case. Focusing on per animal performance is better than number of animals if you have sufficient scale. And there's different resources out there we can read up on that more. For cattle, herd productivity is the main driver of income. Price received isn't a profit driver as it isn't within your control, whereas herd productivity is. We measure that in terms of kilos of beef produced per AE. That comes down to reproductive rate, mortality rate, and sale weight. Optimising each of them will maximise the income. Targeting your herd expenditure. Better producers spend less on their herds but get more productivity. Their discretionary expenditure is targeted, or they don't spend it. And labour efficiency is another critical aspect of it, and usually the single biggest way you can influence costs, and you need to have at least 1,500 AE for every full-time equivalent. If you don't, it's going to be hard to have a competitive cost base. Wool flock, the three most important things I think are fleece value, achieved through wool cut and micron, and in re-establishing your flock or looking at drought recovery, I'd be looking at how you can source the genetics that's going to give you the highest possible fleece value. Carcass and meat value is a distraction for a pure wool flock. Good wool flocks over time will generate over 70% of their income from wool and less than 30% from meat. You only sell them once, but you want to shear them every year. So focus on the wool as your main product. The meat is simply a byproduct. Use the FP index in selecting rams and ignore the DP index. Managed very well, wool flocks will outperform other enterprises. So this is the exception I referred to before. If they're done well, they are more profitable, but they need to be done well. You need to have the land, the infrastructure, and the passion and skills to do them. Meat sheep, I think the key question there is, can you consistently, which means about at least 7 in every 10 years, finish the progeny as lambs? If you can have a good meat sheep operation. If you're having to sell them as stores, that really limits the potential income of the enterprise, particularly given that you don't have wool to complement the income. Goats, they're a high value animal at the moment and very hardy. Key question is, do they get a free lunch? This is something I've heard a bit of recently, with people saying that the goats just eat browse and therefore can co-graze with others and effectively get a free lunch. And I'll have a look at a graph on that in a second. The other question with goats is whether you can achieve high levels of productivity in captivity versus in a wild harvest situation. And you need to compare them against alternatives on a DSE basis. Just want to have a look now at a graph. This was some very good research that was done about 20 years ago in the Charleville area, looking at the diets of different grazing herbivores. And we can see there with goats being predominantly browse, but there is still a lot of forbs and grass in their diet. Sheep and cattle have a mixture of forbs, grass and browse, but the goats aren't entirely browse. 75% of the sheep and cattle, or 70 to 75% of sheep and cattle diets are grass and forbs, and 43% of goats diet is grass and forbs. So if that's the most limiting factor, the amount of grass and forbs that are available, then those animals are going to be competing for the same resource. The goats aren't getting a free lunch. I think that's a useful bit of information, and that publication is quite good, I think, covering that. Adjustment can be an option for people. I think the demand, in terms of the demand for adjustment, is going to be dependent on time, the season that people receive, and we don't know what that's going to be, but it could be a competitive market. So I think it'd be good to think about, if you're looking to do this, what's going to differentiate you in that market? Is it your location, the scale you're able to offer, or the time frame? And as you get into more scale and longer time frame, you get towards a leasing option, which I'll talk about. So is leasing an option? From the lessor's point of view, if you're not, so the person leasing the property out, if you're not sure if you have the capacity, whether that be financial or personal, for drought recovery, and you don't want to sell the property, it can be a real option. There's lots of young, keen people looking to get into the industry where the price of land is a big barrier to that, and this can be a way for them to get in that works well for both parties. From the lessee, can be a way to get in without the capital. You need to have the right lessor, and you need to do your sums very, very well. 4 to 6%, which are the rates that are often quoted, are likely to be unsustainable and be on a hide into nothing. Not in every circumstance, but in most, and I have seen that happen with bad outcomes. You need to do the sums well, which I'll run through. So from a lessor's point of view, I think it's important to have a look at what we're actually receiving in average annual cash flows from the business when you owned it. How much cash were you getting after your operating expenses when it was your stock and your risk? And that's what you need to compare the potential lease payment to. What value do you place on retaining the ownership and capital gains going forward? From the lessee's point of view, the way to work it out is what's the expected operating profit from the lease, including owner wages, but before you pay any lease payment. Once you work that out, ask how much of that do you need to cover your capital and risk from the exercise, and what's left over to pay the lessor. Then you need to decide how R&M is going to be managed, CapEx, who's going to pay the rates, etc. But done well, it can work well for both parties. Should you stay or should you go following the drought? This is a very complex and a very personal decision, and there's lots of things to consider. The financial side of it, personal, family, legacy, and also what alternative options you have for your time and also your capital. From a financial perspective, I think the key question is, will capital be eroded, preserved or grown if you stay? Having a good think about that and looking at the wealth of the family and whether staying is going to be the best thing for that, I think is an important consideration, and there are many others. And also quality of life. What quality of life are you going to have staying on, and disposable household income compared to going and doing something else. And again, leasing it out is an option if you don't want to sell it. Financing drought recovery, I think an important consideration is what are your reserves in terms of FMDs, undrawn debt, and personal capital. I've got a couple of question marks there because it can be quite hard to get dollars off farm and set up off farm, and that's an important part of retirement and succession. So bringing dollars from off farm back in, I think shouldn't be ruled out, but it should be very carefully thought out and done with careful consideration. Budget your cash flow for the next 3 years. What does it look like? What's the shortfall going to be and when? And use this to look at those different scenarios we went through before. Seek professional help. There's Kat's going to talk about the RFDS and what they do. There's rural financial counsellors who are very good that are out there. There's also private advisors such as myself who do this for a living, all of which can help you look at where you're at and look at what the best options are going forward. Understand the workings, the pros and cons of different options, such as the RIC loans, Q-Rider, and that sort of thing. They've changed a lot in the last couple of years, but it's important to understand them and how they may work for your business. Be proactive with your bank. Take them your cash flow, take them your sums, tell them what your plan is. They don't like surprises. If you don't surprise them, you're going to have a greater chance of being able to work with them. If you do surprise them, or if they have to start ringing you, you're probably going to be in trouble. Use your network. I think that's an important aspect of this. You're not Robinson Crusoe here. There's going to be a lot of people in the same situation. Communicate within your team, within the business. Make sure you keep that communication going and everyone's on the same page in developing that recovery plan, because that can be a positive way of doing it that gives people some certainty there. Excuse me. Then I think it's important to look across your district and network and ask who out there always has a glass half full approach to life and leaves you feeling positive. Or who's the producer in your district that whose land and stock always seem in better condition than everyone else's, or whose wisdom and opinions you really value. Find them, seek them out, and go and have a yarn to them. Talk through where you're at, what you're thinking, what your options are, and things like that. And quite often, I think you'll find that just going through that process of being clear on where you're at, what you're thinking, what your options are, to be able to talk to someone else and articulating it to someone else will help your thinking and help you understand where you're at and what the best way forward is, as much as any feedback from them will. So in conclusion, there are no easy answers and every circumstance is unique. I think it's important to have a plan. You can change the plan if circumstances change, but have a plan regardless. Focus on making the correct decisions more than the right ones. There's a very good book on this, I think, called Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke, who's a professional poker player, who talks about gambling and taking risks. And farming in some ways is gambling and taking risks, and I think that is a useful resource. Know your long-term carrying capacity and land condition. Consider all aspects of the drought recovery juggle: the livestock numbers, the land condition, cash flow, personal well-being. There are trade-offs and antagonisms there, but make sure you keep an eye on all of them as you go through the drought recovery. Be clear on what your core business is and what the success factors for it are. Look at all options, and one of those options may be moving on. If you do stay, have an eye on getting that core business back up to full capacity as soon as possible. Develop simple and clear forward budgets so you can see what's coming and evaluate different options. Use your network, because there's a lot of experience and wisdom there, and utilise professional assistance.